Wait, I'm Abby, and this is my presentation on supervolcano eruptions and if it would be the end of the world or not, and if this is potentially a apocalyptic event. So what is a supervolcano? Basically, it's a volcano that measures an 8 on the volcanic explosivity index, which we'll talk about more on the next slide. But it's a super eruption with basically, like, if a supervolcano were to erupt, it would have the force of 1,000 Hiroshima bombs every second, and this would go on for a large amount of time. And so these are absolutely huge, and we haven't had an explosion from a supervolcano in any of our life, like before humans were around. So it would be a big deal if this were to happen. And so I don't know if you can see, but in the background there's a slight picture, and it just basically shows this giant magma chamber underneath the Earth, and it would create this big caldera on the surface and erupt off. So this is the volcanic explosion index, also known as VEI, so I'll refer to it. And it's a relative measure of explosiveness of the volcanic eruption. It's based on the scale from 0 to 8. 0 would be most of the volcanic eruptions in Hawaii with just like lava flows where there's no big eruption, versus an 8 would be a supervolcano eruption, or like what they call a super eruption. The factors it's based on is the amount of material ejected, how high the material goes, how long the explosion lasts for. And so it's, yeah, like I said, 0 would be non-explosive, 8 is the largest explosion in history, mega colossal. This could eject up to 240 miles of material out and produce a cloud column height of over 12 miles. So just imagine 12 miles of smoke from this eruption, how huge that would be. So the Yellowstone supervolcano is the main one I'm going to focus on. It's the one that we hear about the most, I'd say. And if you can recall, there was like recently talk of, or not recently, but within the last few years, talk of like, is it going to explode? It's overdue, and like, what will happen if it does? So first, I'm just going to kind of go over what it is and like the history of it, and then go into what would happen if it did explode, what are the odds of it exploding, and all that. So basically, it began erupting 2.1 million years ago. That was when the first largest eruption was. And then there's been 3 major eruptions since then. One, the 2.1 million years ago, one 1.2 million years ago, and one 640,000 years ago. People say we're long overdue for an eruption, but this might not necessarily be true, and I think it's hyped up a lot more in media than it would actually be in reality. And in this photo, if you take a closer look, this shows the largest eruption ash fall compared to other large eruptions in the US. So the Lava Creek ash was that first eruption 2.1 million years ago, and just shows how far the initial ash would go. Not just like the stuff in the air that would fall later, but this is like the immediate area. And so just imagine that, like, that's more than half the US, that's so many major cities and everything. One of the other major ones in the US is the Long Valley caldera in California, and that's had other smaller eruptions, but they're still large. I mean, if you look at this yellow bit, the light yellow under the darker yellow, and this right here, and all the way around here, and that's still a hugely substantial amount. And if you see up here, you can see Mount St. Helens eruption, and that's one that we've all learned about and everything, and that was a huge eruption to us. So just compare that to something like the Lava Creek ash and just see how big this thing would actually be if it happened. So are we really overdue for an eruption? That's the biggest question here. And scientists basically say that volcanoes don't work like clockwork. It's not predictable. They don't follow a schedule. And often most volcanoes that have a super eruption don't have them more than once, and if they do, they don't follow a pattern. So volcanoes might erupt every certain amount of years, but a supervolcano, super eruption, is not likely to happen more than once. And since this one has happened more than once, it's not likely to happen at the same size as the one that already happened. But people want an answer, so basically scientists did the math, and they averaged the previous explosions, and it came out to happening about every 750,000 years. And so since the last one happened 640,000 years ago, there's still over 100,000 more years to go until this were to happen again. But this is all in theory because like I said, they're not predictable and they don't work on this time schedule like that. But basically, the risk of it happening isn't huge, especially not in our lifetime. If it was going to happen, it would be way down the line and we wouldn't be around. And then the other thing to consider is that this huge thing sitting under Yellowstone, it might erupt, but it might not necessarily be a super eruption. It might just be something lighter. I don't know. 70,000 years ago, there was a lava flow eruption, but it's not going to be the big end of the world event that people hype it up to be. So basically, if this were to happen, say something crazy, I don't know, out of the blue happens and this Yellowstone volcano were to erupt, this image you can see is kind of the famous one that gets circulated that shows the direct affected area. But 90% of people within 620 miles of the eruption would be killed instantly. Or not instantly, but from the explosion directly, you know, the ash, and it's the amount of material that this thing would blow is insane. And so that would be the first major effect that would just automatically kill thousands of people. And then we just have ash worldwide because it goes into the atmosphere. And the article that I was looking at specifically was from BBC, so they were talking about the effects of this from the perspective of people in England, in Britain. And they said they would have ash fall like snow, like a flurry, would be a dusting on the ground. If you look over on this map, us up here in like New England area, we'd only have, you know, a centimeter or two of ash, but that, like, a centimeter or two of ash falling is a big deal if something happened all the way out in Wyoming. So it would still be huge. But one of the biggest things, and we learned about this in one of the films that we watched and from some of the readings, would be the volcanic winter. That's going to have one of the greatest effects, because basically what's going to happen is all the ash in the atmosphere is going to cloud it up and everything, and we're going to have dark, you know, cloudy days. Like, we're not going to see the sun, and the global temperature is going to drop considerably. And even considerably, if you think, oh, it's going to go down 10 degrees, that's not a huge deal. But if you think about the entire Earth's temperature going down suddenly, and this would sustain for 6 to 12 years. So this is a huge deal, several years of like an altered climate from this one event. And that would make a huge impact. But then also I read about how we think about the temperature, but then we have to think about the things that temperature affects. So that could be like the monsoon season, and this would totally throw off the monsoon season or make it so it doesn't happen as a result of this eruption. And then that would put, you know, half the Asian countries out of their food, that like they rely on the monsoon season to produce this. So the whole southern hemisphere, everything would be just off, and this would be disastrous for communities and people and cities down there, especially ones that we rely on food from. And it just would start this whole ball of effects basically going from it. And then mass starvation and a whole bunch of nasty stuff. And then finally, we talk about the Yellowstone one, but there's supervolcanoes all around the world. This little map here you can see shows all the largest recorded volcanic eruptions in the world. And so you see on the bottom this ones that are 8 or greater VEI. And the other thing, here's a side note about VEI, is that there's no limit to it. 8 is just the greatest we've seen. Something could happen that's larger than that, and that's just the largest thing that we have to compare to. So 8 is the max, but there's no limit to it. It could go over that. There's nothing above it, but there could be. So basically these 8 ones, you can see Yellowstone, you can see the one in California, there's some in New Zealand. The one in Indonesia, Toba caldera, is often spoken about when talking about supervolcanoes, because that was also an extremely large eruption that was very bad. So some of the others, like I said, Long Valley caldera in California, Toba caldera in Indonesia, the Topu caldera in New Zealand, Era caldera in Japan, and Campi Flegrei in Italy. You see there's also one down in South America, there's one in Central America, you see one in Africa. So this would be this could potentially be a global issue or happen in other places, not just the Yellowstone one. That's just the one we've heard about the most, because I think we've seen a lot in the media, that this gets hyped up as this end of the world event. And so my personal opinion on it would be that I'm not sure if it would necessarily end the world, like, apocalypse, but it would change a lot of things. And just knowing how the US is, if such a huge population died suddenly, I feel like we kind of get this mass pandemonium chaos, and like things would fall apart from that more than the direct impact from the eruption. So I think this has potential to be a huge thing, but I'm also, from what I've read and the scientific stuff I've read, it's less likely to happen than people say it is. So ultimately, I wouldn't be worried about it. Some people still would, but I don't think something like this would stop me from moving to an area near a supervolcano, as much as the threat may be there. I don't think it's great enough to, change my life for it. But that being said, you never know. Like I said, it's very unpredictable, but scientists are tracking it. They keep really close watch on this. And so we will be able to have a general sense, and we would hope that the scientists could spot this, and, we would have warning. I mean, not us, but, people in direct areas could get away from the region. But best case scenario, yes. But that is it. Thank you.